So, Archie, um, let's just start with this. I mean, how did it come to be that a grand jury in Pennsylvania was tasked with writing a 1,300 page report?
Well, clearly there were plenty of reports, as you can see by the 1,000 victims. There were plenty of reports over the years. In fact, many of them were swept under the rug by law enforcement as many as 30 years ago for political and professional career reasons. So it's been around. It just takes a prosecutor with the courage to take on the Catholic Church, which is no small task.
All right. Well, so give us. I mean, so we have this 1,300 page report. Give us the sort of the broad strokes. It's pretty. It's stunning and disturbing. Obviously,
it's stunning and it's disturbing in the just the letters back and forth between the priests on the cover up and the shuffle them off to Buffalo and how they diminish the claims of the victim and put the weight on the shoulders of the parents to shut their kid up. And, so the graphic truth of it is what is so shocking, so stunning. And then when one thinks that and recognizes and realizes that this was hidden by the priests under policies and procedures dictated to them by the cardinals, whatever is above shocking, that's what this is.
Okay, so we're talking about this report. Like I said, 1,300 pages, covers 70 years of alleged abuse. It involves over 300 so-called predator priests who have targeted, like you mentioned, nearly 1,000, I guess, what were children. I mean, some of these people now, I would imagine, are, maybe as old as their 80s or 90s.
Yeah, the one guy on the cover of the New York Times was 83 years old. He was abused in 1947.
And so this is, so tell us just like where, before we get into the actual information that was in there, like where do they get this information? How do they go back 70 years? Is it all simply sitting down with victims or alleged victims and taking testimony? What are the different sources of evidence to construct this, this timeline and these different narratives?
25 years ago, I handled one of these cases, and it was impossible for me to obtain any letters or any writings of the on the personnel file of the priest, simply because the law is protected. There was collaboration. You had to go to D.C. to the Office of the Holy See in the United States to take the deposition of the custodians, and they would produce nothing and would cover up and lie about what documents did not exist in the file. And so during the course of the years, that's some 20 some odd years, the rules on the confidentiality and what has to be reported, because remember, these are reports of child abuse. And so under the umbrella of child abuse, expansion into these previously hidden and shielded reports became accessible under properly affected subpoena power of the courts and prosecutors in Pennsylvania.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about what was found, and I guess before we move on, that the changes, do they reflect the fact that there was more access to this type of material? Does that reflect changes in both society's tolerance for keeping this stuff locked up, and or the Catholic Church's willingness to open up?
I can tell you that it would not be the Catholic Church's willingness to open up without some serious pressure, and that pressure has been around for years. But the cases in Louisiana back in the early 90s, mid 80s, were really the first signs where multiple victims began to come forward. And it then happened in Texas, and then it happened in Boston, and it happened around the country, where this mass numbers of victims began to force the hands of the legislators and the law enforcement to stop assisting the church in covering this up. So it sort of evolved with, actually, the truth is, a lot of courageous plaintiffs' lawyers willing to spend their own money and fight for discovery of the materials, and then the legislatures had to follow suit because of the pressure from the communities of protecting these child predators.
So, okay, so we have basically, it seems to me, two sets of offenses here, right? There's the initial offense by the predator themselves. And then there's the secondary offense, which is the response of the institution in what seems to be purposely, misinvestigating this or investigating it and not responding in the proper way. So let's just start with the predator aspect of this. Some of the stories that have come out of this are harrowing in terms of what these priests, who they targeted and in the means in which they targeted some of these children.
Well, not only that, I mean, you have printed in the report the estimate of 1,000 victims. Even the grand jury themselves realize that there are many multiple thousands. What we know medically and psychologically about the disease of pedophilia, it is a recurring problem that just happens over and over and over again, and that's what's so criminal about the church finding out that these children have been abused and raped, pulling the priest out after only they didn't do it immediately. It had to take numerous events of rape, and then they would send them out of the community to recovery facilities owned by the Catholic Church in other states, rehab them over a course of a few months, and visit them in other communities and parishes in other states, knowing full well that they were going to relapse into the disease. So you're right. There is, of course, the initial criminal act, but what I believe to be criminal conduct on top of that in the cover-up. And in fact, the grand jury talks about that.
But some of these the mechanisms in which these predators would target their victims. I've read reports that there would be special rosary beads given to some of these kids that indicated to other priests that they were being groomed in some fashion. And that some of the abuse was, involved depictions of Jesus, and
the emotional and physical and spiritual abuse and cruelty that these people, who obviously are communicators, ostensibly faith-based people, they obviously had charisma, and they used all those weapons to induce and seduce these children into their trust and the families into their trust, and abused it. And so that's the one level. But this level that you talk about that I think is really what's brazen and continues to this day to be problematic is the cardinals instituted a playbook. They would say,
well, Archie, before we get to, let's take a break. When we come back, Let's talk about the mechanisms that were developed to essentially hide these offenses from the public, from accountability, and which basically allowed them to continue. Yep. We're going to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. We'll be right back after this.